Welcome to Books and More, the channel where we explore timeless works that have shaped the human story. Today, we journey into the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, a monumental masterpiece of historical writing. With its sweeping narrative, sharp intellect, and profound reflections on power, virtue, and decay, Gibbon's work remains one of the greatest achievements in literature. Join us as we uncover the rise, the glory, and the eventual collapse of one of the world's most extraordinary civilizations. Chapter 66: Union of the Greek and Latin Churches. In this chapter, I recount one of the most delicate and tragic episodes in the late history of the Byzantine Empire, the attempted reunion of the Greek and Latin churches, a project born not from spiritual harmony but from political desperation, and fated from the very beginning to fail. For centuries, the eastern and western branches of Christendom had looked upon each other with suspicion and disdain. The Greeks, proud heirs of the councils and fathers of antiquity, regarded the Latins as crude innovators, guilty of altering sacred doctrine and corrupting the purity of the faith. The Latins, in turn, saw the Greeks as subtle rhetoricians who cloaked their pride in theological nuance. The schism, though originally rooted in disputes over phrases and hierarchies, had hardened into a mutual aversion that defined two civilizations. Yet political necessity has often compelled men to embrace what their hearts reject, and it was precisely such necessity that now drove the Emperor John Palaiologos to attempt what his predecessors had failed to achieve: the union of the divided churches under the authority of Rome. The empire at this time faced its last and most formidable enemy. The Ottomans, united, disciplined, and advancing with inexorable force, pressed the shrinking borders of Byzantium from all sides. Constantinople, once the Queen of the East, had become a lonely, exhausted city, isolated from its former territories, surrounded by enemies, and dependent on unreliable allies. The emperor understood that without substantial military aid from the West, the capital could not long resist the tightening grip of the Ottoman sultans. But Western aid had a price. The popes, wielding the spiritual authority of Latin Christendom, demanded unconditional submission. The Greeks must accept the doctrines, rites, and supremacy of Rome. Thus, the question of union was not an abstract debate, but a matter of survival. And John Palaiologos, with reluctance but also with clarity, resolved to lead a delegation to the Great Council that would convene in Italy. The Greeks embarked for Italy with solemn apprehension. Among them were bishops, theologians, court officials, and the emperor himself. Their arrival was greeted with ceremonial magnificence, but beneath the hospitality lay a firm expectation. The Greeks had come to be persuaded, instructed, and ultimately subdued. The council first met at Ferrara and later at Florence, where representatives from both churches gathered to debate the most contentious doctrines, above all, the procession of the Holy Spirit, the use of leavened or unleavened bread, the existence of purgatory, and the supremacy of the Roman pontiff. For months the debates continued, conducted with an air of civility, but overshadowed by the immense imbalance of power. The Latins were numerous, confident, and supported by the prestige of a united West. The Greeks, exhausted and in a foreign land, found themselves pressed by political necessity as much as theological argument. The emperor urged reconciliation, for he knew the stakes. The bishops hesitated, torn between their duty to their sovereign and their loyalty to the faith of their ancestors. Gradually, under the weight of persuasion, fatigue, and subtle coercion, the Greek delegation yielded. Their signatures were affixed to the decree of union, and the council proclaimed with triumph that the two churches, long divided, were now one. Yet the victory was hollow, for the union had been won by force, not conviction. Even among the Greek clergy who had signed, many did so with heavy reluctance. Some wept, others declared they acted only to save their nation, and many more resolved secretly never to enforce the terms. The emperor returned to Constantinople, carrying a treaty that promised Western assistance, but he also carried with him the seeds of internal revolt. If the Western princes greeted the union with polite approval but little military enthusiasm, the reception among the Greeks was far more dramatic. When the decree was read in Constantinople, the reaction was immediate and furious. The population, long accustomed to seeing the Latins as heretics and oppressors, recoiled from the very idea of submission to Rome. Monks thundered from their pulpits that the emperor and his bishops had betrayed the Orthodox faith. Merchants, artisans, and soldiers refused to attend services conducted by clergy who supported the union, and public life became a theater of denunciation. The union, conceived as a lifeline for the empire, became instead a source of deeper division. Few political leaders have found themselves in a more tragic position than John Palaiologos. Compelled by necessity to sign a treaty that his people would never accept, and condemned to watch the last hope of salvation dissolve in anger. The intransigence of the Greeks was not simply stubbornness. It reflected centuries of cultural identity. They saw themselves as custodians of the true Christian tradition, untainted by what they considered Latin innovation. They remembered, too, the dreadful sack of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade, an atrocity that had left wounds so deep that even 2 centuries later, forgiveness was impossible. To submit to Rome for them was not a theological compromise, but a national humiliation. And so, while the emperor struggled to enforce the union, the people rejected it, the clergy denounced it, and the hoped-for military aid from the West never materialized in sufficient force to matter. Meanwhile, the Ottoman threat grew more ominous. The sultans watched the disarray of their enemy with cold satisfaction, understanding that the Greeks were more divided than ever. Mehmet II, the future conqueror of Constantinople, ascended to the throne with a determination that dwarfed any political hope the Byzantines could muster. The failure of union, moral, political, and spiritual, left the empire isolated at the very moment when unity was essential. The last years of Byzantium thus unfolded under a cloud of resignation, the emperor constrained by an agreement his people rejected, the people clinging to their faith even as their state collapsed, and the city awaiting the storm that would at last sweep it away. The chapter closes with Gibbon's melancholy judgment. The union of the churches failed because it was never truly desired by those whose acceptance was indispensable. It was an alliance born not from agreement, but from necessity, and necessity is a frail foundation for religious harmony. The tragedy of the Greeks was that, in defending their faith with unbending zeal, they sacrificed the possibility of military salvation. The tragedy of the emperor was that his political truculence could not overcome the spiritual pride of his subjects. And the tragedy of the empire was that it perished not only by the sword of the Ottoman, but by the irreconcilable passions of its own people. The attempted union, far from saving Byzantium, revealed its deepest fractures and hastened its fall, leaving only the memory of a final, futile effort to reconcile 2 worlds long destined to remain apart. Chapter 67: Schism of the Greeks and Latins. In this chapter, I recount the long and sorrowful estrangement between the Greek and Latin branches of Christendom, a division that, though born from theological disputes, grew into a deep cultural hostility and ultimately shaped the tragic destiny of Byzantium. What began as a subtle disagreement over doctrine and ritual hardened, through centuries of misunderstanding and pride, into an irreconcilable schism. It became a gulf through which no bridge could be built, even when the very survival of the Eastern Empire depended on healing it. The Greeks, guardians of the ancient councils and of a tradition they believed to be purer and more philosophical than that of the West, resented the claims of supremacy advanced by the Roman pontiff. The Latins, assured of the authority and unity conferred upon them by their bishop, regarded the Greeks as obstinate, contentious, and dangerously inclined toward heresy. In this mutual disdain, neither side could fully recognize the virtues of the other, and each magnified the faults it wished to condemn. By the late Middle Ages, the schism had become an accepted fact, woven into the identity of both peoples. Yet history is often merciless in presenting moments when ancient convictions collide with present necessity, and such a moment arrived when the Ottoman power advanced steadily toward Constantinople. The Byzantine emperors, weakened by civil war, economic ruin, and the collapse of their Asian provinces, looked increasingly toward the West for aid. They knew, however, that Latin princes and popes would not shed blood and treasure for a people who refused to acknowledge the authority of Rome. Thus, the question of union between the churches ceased to be a matter of speculative theology. It became a question of political survival. The Greeks found themselves torn between faith and necessity. The emperors, mindful of the danger at their gates, urged compromise. The clergy, steeped in centuries of polemic, resisted. The population, fiercely proud of their orthodoxy and haunted by memories of the Latin sack of Constantinople in 1204, recoiled at the idea of submission. This emotional resistance was so profound that even the most skillful diplomacy could barely touch it. Yet desperation drove the imperial court onward, and the Emperor John Palaiologos journeyed to Italy, accompanied by bishops, monks, ministers, and the patriarchal representative, to seek a reconciliation with Rome. The council in Italy, first at Ferrara, then at Florence, was conducted with the pomp and ritual of the Latin Church, which never forgot the majesty of its universal claims. The Greeks, exhausted from travel and weakened by years of privation, found themselves debating on foreign soil, surrounded by theologians who saw in the disputed doctrines not simply questions of faith, but symbols of authority. For months, long and intricate discussions filled the halls of the council. The Latins argued with scholastic precision, the Greeks with the subtler logic of their fathers. But beneath the surface of debate lay the political realities that never ceased to influence the affairs of men. The emperor pressed his clergy to yield. The clergy resisted with a mixture of sorrow and indignation. The Latins, knowing their advantage, remained firm. Eventually, the Greek delegation capitulated. They accepted the Latin formula on the procession of the Holy Spirit, acknowledged the Roman primacy, and consented to the union of the churches. Tears were shed, consciences tormented, and the signatures of the Greek bishops were affixed with trembling hands. The council proclaimed victory. East and West were at last reunited. But this triumph, so glowingly recorded in Latin memory, concealed an uncomfortable truth. The Greeks had yielded not out of conviction, but under the weight of desperation. The emperor returned to Constantinople with the decree of union, hoping that Western aid would soon follow. But he returned to a city ready to explode. The people, who had endured centuries of poverty and humiliation, refused to surrender the one treasure they believed remained to them: the purity of their faith. When the terms of union were announced, churches fell silent, monks thundered from their pulpits, and the learned clergy denounced the emperor as a traitor to orthodoxy. Many of the bishops who had signed at Florence now repudiated what they had agreed to. Others hid in shame. The patriarch refused to endorse the decree, and the populace, in overwhelming majority, regarded the union as a betrayal of Christ and a capitulation to the enemies of the Greek Church. The emperor, trapped between the demands of the West and the fury of his own subjects, could neither enforce the union nor fully abandon it. He occupied a position of profound loneliness, despised by his own people for signing the treaty, yet unable to secure the military help that had been the purpose of the council. The Latins, though momentarily pleased by the appearance of submission, were reluctant to mount a large crusade on behalf of a people who could not accept the very terms they had sworn to uphold. Thus, the empire drifted, neither reconciled nor protected, as Ottoman armies gathered strength. The schism, far from being healed, became sharper than before. The Greek clergy condemned the unionist bishops, the monasteries denounced imperial policy, and the people refused even the smallest hint of Latin ritual. The bitterness extended beyond Constantinople itself, reaching the Orthodox communities of the Balkans and Russia, who excommunicated the Florentine Union with an indignation matched only by their cultural self-confidence. Whatever unity the council had hoped to create dissolved in an atmosphere of suspicion, resentment, and fear. The empire, weakened in spirit as much as in arms, faced its final trials divided within and unprotected without. Gibbon treats this episode not merely as a political failure, but as a tragedy. He sees in it the fatal collision between principle and necessity. The Greeks, defending the heritage of centuries, refused to bend even when the sword lay at their throats. The emperor, compelled by the cold logic of survival, embraced a compromise that his conscience may have tolerated, but his nation did not. The Latins, confident in their claims, extended a hand that was offered more as a demand than an invitation, and the Ottomans, observing the discord of their enemies, prepared themselves for the decisive conquest. The chapter closes with the somber reflection that the attempted union of Florence achieved nothing but the revelation of how deep the schism had grown. It had ceased to be a matter of doctrine, it had become the identity of nations, and thus, at the very moment when unity was most needed, it proved impossible. The empire would soon face its final siege, alone in spirit as in power, and the long quarrel between Greek and Latin, instead of yielding reconciliation, would remain as one of the mournful preludes to the fall of Constantinople. Chapter 68. Reign of Mahomet II and the Extinction of the Eastern Empire. In this final great movement of Byzantine history, the stage is dominated by a single figure whose energy, ambition, and relentless purpose brought to an end the last remnant of Roman majesty, Mahomet II, or Mehmet the Conqueror. His ascent to the Ottoman throne marked not merely a succession, but the beginning of a new epoch in the East. Barely 19 years old, yet possessing the determination of a seasoned sovereign, he inherited from his father a flourishing army, an expanding frontier, and a sense that destiny itself had appointed him to finish what ages of warfare had prepared. From childhood, he had contemplated the walls of Constantinople not as an eternal symbol of Christian resistance, but as a challenge to be mastered. Once enthroned, he gave himself wholly to this enterprise, understanding with a clarity beyond his years that the conquest of the city would complete the rise of the Ottoman state and extinguish the thousand-year twilight of the Eastern Empire. Constantine XI, the last of the Palaiologoi, faced him with a courage that seemed equal parts duty and resignation. The emperor ruled a kingdom reduced to a single city, its population diminished, its treasury empty, its army a patchwork of mercenaries and volunteers. Yet he bore his burden with a dignity that impressed even his enemies. He knew the empire could not withstand the Ottoman tide, but he commanded with a steadfastness that preserved, if not safety, at least honor. His attempts to secure aid from the West were hampered by the bitter divisions created by the attempted union of the Greek and Latin churches, and the city's clergy, far from offering unity, rekindled old resentments just when unity was most necessary. Thus, the emperor fought not only against the vast armies of the Sultan, but also against the weariness and disunion of his own people. Mahomet, meanwhile, moved swiftly and with discipline. His first action was the construction of the great fortress on the European shore of the Bosporus, Rumeli Hisar, whose massive towers rose like sentinels overlooking the strait. Opposite it stood the older fortress on the Asian shore. Together, they formed a vice that choked the maritime lifeline of Constantinople and declared unmistakably the Sultan's intention. The Greeks protested, but their protests were as feeble as their defenses. When a Venetian ship dared ignore the new Ottoman authority on the strait, Mahomet ordered the vessel sunk and the survivors impaled on the spot. Such displays, savage but decisive, revealed the character of the young ruler, merciless in punishment, methodical in preparation, and utterly resolved. For the siege, he assembled an army whose size astonished contemporaries, a host of soldiers from across the empire, including the disciplined janissaries, the traditional Turkish cavalry, and auxiliary forces drawn from many nations. But the most formidable element was his artillery. Seeking to break the legendary walls of Constantinople, he employed a Hungarian engineer, Urban, who crafted enormous cannons the likes of which Europe had never seen. One colossal piece, said to hurl stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds, was laboriously dragged across the countryside and positioned before the land walls. When it spoke, the thunder rolled across the city like an omen, shaking the confidence of those who had believed their walls impregnable. The siege began in April 1453. The defenders, though few in number, were led by capable men, foremost among them Giovanni Giustiniani of Genoa, whose courage and expertise galvanized the resistance along the Theodosian walls. Day after day, the Ottoman batteries shattered the ancient stone, while the Greeks and their limed allies rushed to repair the breaches by night. Mahomet alternated bombardment with direct assaults, testing the defenders' strength at every point. The Golden Horn, protected by a massive chain, seemed secure until the Sultan executed one of his boldest stratagems. He ordered his ships to be dragged over land on greased timbers into the inner harbor. By this maneuver, he turned the harbor's defenses against the city itself, forcing the Greeks to fight on every side at once. The weeks that followed were filled with continual struggle. The defenders, though exhausted, displayed a tenacity worthy of their forebears. Constantinople, once the envy of emperors, had become a battlefield of narrow streets and battered gates. The people prayed in Hagia Sophia, the vast cathedral still magnificent despite centuries of decline, and the emperor walked among them as both sovereign and fellow sufferer. Yet the end approached with tragic certainty. When Giustiniani, gravely wounded, was carried from the walls, the morale of the defenders collapsed. Constantine XI, seeing the breach widening and the Janissaries rushing forward, cast aside his imperial insignia and threw himself into the melee, choosing to die as a soldier rather than flee as a king. His body was never found, but his memory remained as the last flame of Roman courage. With the fall of the walls, the city was abandoned to the conquerors. The Ottomans poured in with irresistible force. Mahomet, allowing his troops the customary 3 days of plunder, surveyed his triumph from horseback. But when he entered Hagia Sophia, where survivors had taken refuge, he did so not as a mere destroyer. Striking the marble floor with his sword, he proclaimed the cathedral a mosque, thereby imbuing the conquest with a symbolic finality. The transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul was not only military and political, but spiritual. A city that had been the seat of Christian emperors for a millennium now bowed to the crescent. Yet Mahomet, for all his severity, was not blind to the value of the city he had taken. Once the initial chaos subsided, he turned to rebuilding. He sought to repopulate the city, inviting Greeks, Armenians, and Jews alike to return or settle anew. He restored markets, repaired walls, and laid the foundations of imperial institutions that would shape Ottoman rule for centuries. Under his direction, Constantinople became once again a great metropolis, no longer Christian, no longer Roman, but still the center of an empire. The extinction of the Eastern Empire was thus both violent and strangely dignified. It had long been dying, worn down by internal strife, economic decay, and centuries of unrelenting enemies. Mahomet did not destroy a healthy state. He claimed the remnants of a world whose vitality had fled. Yet the moment of its fall reverberated through Europe. The ancient empire of Constantine, which had preserved classical knowledge, Christian theology, and imperial statecraft through 1,000 storms, had perished. Scholars fled westward, carrying with them the texts and traditions that would help ignite the Renaissance. And the city that had once been the bulwark of Christendom became the heart of a new, expanding empire, poised to reshape the balance of the world. The chapter closes with a meditation on the impermanence of power. No walls, however strong, no traditions, however venerable, no lineage, however ancient, can withstand the currents of history when vigor is lost and unity dissolves. With the death of Constantine XI and the triumph of Mahomet II, the long drama of Rome, first in the West, then in the East, reached its final act. The empire fallen, its memory remained, a vast shadow over the past, and a stern reminder of how greatness rises, flourishes, and yields at last to forces stronger than itself. Chapter 69. State of Rome from the 12th century onward, we move through a landscape where the grandeur of antiquity lingers like a fading echo, while the turbulence of medieval ambition reshapes the city into something at once diminished and unruly. The Rome of this era was no longer the majestic capital of emperors, but a fractured community caught between the spiritual authority of the popes, the temporal violence of feuding aristocratic families, and the wistful memory of republican liberty. The ancient monuments still stood, silent, imposing, and half-ruined, but the spirit that once animated them had long since fled. In its place rose a restless mixture of ecclesiastical intrigue, civic rebellion, and noble rivalry, which Gibbon describes with a mixture of melancholy and sharp irony. The 12th century saw the stirrings of a peculiar revival. The Roman people, inspired partly by the rediscovered texts of antiquity and partly by resentment toward papal rule, attempted to resurrect the forms, though not the substance, of their ancient republic. The Senate was restored in name. Consuls, tribunes, and civic assemblies reappeared as though conjured from the pages of Livy. But this revival was more theatrical than practical. The Romans of the Middle Ages lacked the discipline, civic virtue, and political sophistication that had sustained their ancestors. Their gestures toward the past were driven less by philosophical commitment than by anger against the temporal pretensions of the popes. In the struggle between papal monarchy and Roman republican nostalgia, each side saw itself as the rightful heir to history, though neither possessed the means to restore true order. In this atmosphere emerged Arnold of Brescia, one of the most striking figures of the age, an austere reformer, a monk turned political agitator, whose fiery sermons denounced the wealth and power of the clergy. Arnold preached a vision in which the Church returned to apostolic poverty and abandoned all temporal dominion. The Romans, eager for any voice that challenged the papal establishment, embraced him as a prophet. Under his influence, the revived Senate asserted its authority, expelled the papal officials, and forced the Pope into flight. Yet the ideals that Arnold pursued with philosophical zeal were ill-suited to the turbulent streets of Rome. The noble families, Colonna, Orsini, Savelli, retained their private armies and fortified towers, and their rivalries regularly plunged the city into violence. The people themselves, capable of sudden enthusiasm, lacked the perseverance to build a lasting civic order. Consequently, Arnold's movement, though dramatic in its rise, was doomed in its execution. The papacy, though forced to retreat temporarily, did not relinquish its claims. Through diplomacy and the support of the German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, the Pope regained the upper hand. Arnold was captured, condemned as a heretic, and executed. His death served as both a warning and a spectacle. Yet the defeat of the reformer did not restore stability. The Roman people persisted in their erratic attempts at self-government, sometimes welcoming the Pope, sometimes defying him, but never achieving a sustainable balance. The papacy itself oscillated between strength and weakness, its authority undermined by internal corruption, external enemies, and the growing influence of foreign monarchs. One of the most destabilizing episodes was the removal of the papal court to Avignon in the 14th century. For nearly 70 years, the popes ruled from this French city rather than from Rome, leaving the Eternal City impoverished and politically adrift. The Roman populace, deprived of the economic and administrative benefits of papal residence, descended further into factionalism. The monuments of antiquity decayed, the streets became dangerous. The noble families entrenched themselves in fortified palaces. Rome survived more as a symbol than as a functioning capital. The return of the popes after the Avignon period did not restore unity. Instead came the Great Schism of the West, during which multiple popes claimed legitimacy: the Roman Pope, the Avignon Pope, and later a third contender elected by a council determined to end the confusion. Europe fractured along political lines, with kingdoms choosing the pope who best aligned with their interests. Rome became the stage of contending claimants, each trying to assert his rule through processions, edicts, and, when necessary, armed force. The city's instability became a reflection of the wider disorder of Christendom. In the midst of this turmoil arose another extraordinary figure, Cola di Rienzi. A man of humble birth, educated by poetic imagination, and inflamed by the rhetoric of ancient republicanism, Rienzi dreamed of restoring Rome to its classical glory. For a brief moment, through eloquence, theatricality, and the exhaustion of the populace with aristocratic violence, he succeeded. He was acclaimed tribune of the people, presided over courts of justice, curbed the excesses of the nobility, and sought to unite Italy under a renewed Roman authority. But Rienzi's idealism could not withstand the political realities of the time. His vanity grew with his power, his reforms faltered when confronted with entrenched aristocratic privilege, and his initial popularity dissolved into resentment. Ultimately, he fell victim to the same chaos he had tried to master, meeting his end in a violent uprising. With the collapse of Rienzi's brief experiment, Rome gradually returned to papal control, though the popes themselves were now more wary, more politic, and more dependent on foreign alliances than before. The 15th century popes, emerging from the Schism, sought to consolidate their authority by transforming Rome into a center of art, learning, and administrative order. They patronized architecture, revived legal institutions, and asserted territorial control over the surrounding papal states. This gradual reorganization marked the final settlement of the ecclesiastical state, laying the groundwork for the centralized and territorial papacy that would dominate early modern Italy. Gibbon observes that by the end of this long arc, Rome had been transformed from a republic of ruins into a princely court. The ancient forms of civic liberty had vanished, replaced by the sovereignty of the papacy. Although this sovereignty bore little resemblance to the mighty empire Rome had once known, it provided a stability that the city had lacked for centuries. The papal state, however imperfect, imposed order upon a population long accustomed to disorder. Under its shadow, Rome began to recover, slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably, from the centuries of decline that had reduced it to a relic of its former self. The chapter concludes with Gibbon's characteristic reflection. Rome's medieval history is neither merely lamentable nor entirely disgraceful. It is the story of a city struggling to reconcile its incomparable past with its fragmented present, a city whose people clung to memories of greatness even as they stumbled through centuries of turbulence. The ruins that surrounded them served as both inspiration and reproach. And in the end, though Rome would never again rise as an imperial power, it would assume a new role, as the spiritual capital of the West and the custodian of a heritage that no conquest could extinguish. Chapter 70, Final Settlement of the Ecclesiastical State. In this chapter, the long and intricate evolution of the papal state reaches its final configuration, not through sudden transformation, but through the slow, often painful processes of conflict, collapse, and eventual consolidation. For centuries, the temporal power of the popes had risen and faltered, alternately challenged by emperors, nobles, and the Roman people themselves. Yet, by the 15th century, and through a sequence of events as turbulent as they were decisive, this power at last assumed its fixed form. The ecclesiastical state emerged from the chaos of medieval Rome, not as a fragment of imperial inheritance, nor as the expression of communal liberty, but as the creation of the popes themselves, forged by their resilience, diplomacy, and occasional ruthlessness. The story begins with a Rome reduced to a husk of its former grandeur. Amid the ruins of the ancient empire lay a city fractured by the ambitions of noble families and the restless desires of the populace. The papacy, though holder of spiritual authority, had repeatedly discovered how fragile its earthly dominion could be. Few episodes illustrate this better than the rise of Cola di Rienzi, the romantic tribune who attempted to revive the ancient republic. Rienzi had dazzled the people with his eloquence and invoked the ghosts of Roman liberty, but his rule, marked by theatrical ambition and political naivete, collapsed as swiftly as it appeared. His tragic fate revealed not only the foolishness of believing that medieval Rome could suddenly revive its classical virtues, but also the precarious grip the papacy held over the city it claimed as its own. Equally destabilizing was the long exile of the popes at Avignon. During this Babylonian captivity, Rome sank into decay. The noble clans, freed from papal supervision, fought viciously among themselves. The urban population dwindled, and the city's monuments crumbled further into desolation. When the papacy finally returned, it found not a capital ready to receive it, but a battlefield where its authority existed only in name. And scarcely had the popes re-established themselves before a more devastating crisis erupted, the Great Schism of the West, in which multiple popes claimed the throne of St. Peter. Christendom fractured along political lines, and Rome became the seat of one claimant among several, its prestige wounded and its administrative order in tatters. It was only through the resolution of the schism at the Council of Constance that the papacy regained a semblance of unity. Martin V, elected as the single legitimate pontiff, returned to a Rome in ruin, yet with an opportunity no pope had possessed for generations, the chance to rebuild both city and state on new foundations. Under his leadership and that of his successors, the popes began the long process of bringing the Roman Campagna and the Papal States under effective control. The great baronial families were curbed, their fortresses dismantled or subdued. Roads, aqueducts, and markets were restored. Administrative offices were reorganized, taxes collected with new regularity, and the authority of the papal government extended over lands that had slipped into near independence. But the consolidation of the ecclesiastical state was not achieved by force alone. It hinged equally on the broader cultural renewal of the age, the revival of learning that we now call the Renaissance. As humanists rediscovered ancient literature and philosophy, the papacy found itself in a position to channel intellectual energies toward the embellishment and glorification of the Holy See. Popes like Nicholas V envisioned Rome not merely as the center of spiritual authority, but as the capital of a revived civilization. Scholars were gathered from across Europe, manuscripts were collected and copied, architects and painters were commissioned to adorn the city with works that rivaled the memory of antiquity. In these undertakings, the popes sought to elevate their dominion above the fleeting contests of temporal rulers, presenting themselves instead as guardians of universal culture. This intellectual revival served a political purpose. By transforming Rome into a center of art and scholarship, the popes strengthened the legitimacy of their temporal power. The city, once a decayed relic, became a stage on which papal sovereignty expressed itself with majesty. The people, drawn by prosperity and spectacle, lent their support to a government that brought stability after centuries of turbulence. Even the noble families, though still influential, found themselves increasingly overshadowed by the grandeur of papal institutions. Thus, cultural ambition and political authority advanced hand in hand, shaping a new Rome that belonged not to emperors or republicans, but to the successors of St. Peter. Yet Gibbon, with his characteristic irony, reminds us that the settlement of the ecclesiastical state was not the triumph of spiritual purity, but of political necessity. The popes, far from embodying the simplicity of the gospel, wielded the instruments of temporal power with the same energy as secular princes. They levied taxes, commanded armies, forged alliances, and defended territory. Their authority rested not only on divine claim, but on the very worldly structures of governance they had painstakingly assembled. Indeed, the papal state's final form emerged not from theological conviction, but from the exhaustion of alternatives. The Roman populace had proved incapable of sustaining a republic, the emperors of Germany were too distant and too divided to maintain authority, the noble families were too self-interested to establish durable order. In this vacuum, the papacy stood as the only institution with continuity, resources, and legitimacy to restore stability. Thus, by the late 15th century, the transformation was complete. The ecclesiastical state had become a coherent territorial principality, governed by the popes with a blend of priestly dignity and princely ambition. Rome itself, though still haunted by the ruins of its imperial past, now possessed a new identity as the capital of the Church. The chaos of previous centuries had receded. The struggles between popes and emperors, between nobles and communes, had given way to an order that would endure into the modern age. And though this settlement was far from embodying the spirit of the ancient republic, it achieved something the intervening centuries had failed to produce: predictable governance, administrative continuity, and a sense of civic purpose. The chapter concludes not with triumph, but with contemplation. Rome, Gibbon suggests, had finally found stability. Yet it was a stability built upon the ruins of its own ancient greatness. The papal state could never rival the imperial Rome of old, nor could it entirely escape the shadows of that former glory. But it had carved out a new role, one that combined religious authority, political control, and cultural patronage into a single, enduring structure. In this settlement lay the paradox of Rome's fate. Its ancient empire vanished, its republican spirit extinguished, yet its influence survived in a form that no conqueror could easily destroy. The ecclesiastical state, whatever its flaws, ensured that Rome remained a center of power, memory, and civilization long after the last emperor had fallen. Chapter 71. Prospect of the ruins of Rome in the 15th century. In contemplating Rome as it appeared in the 15th century, we confront not merely the decay of buildings, but the silent testimony of a civilization whose monumental pride had collapsed into melancholy grandeur. This chapter guides the reader through a landscape where the achievements of antiquity endure only as broken shadows, inviting both admiration and sorrow. For the traveler of that age, whether a pilgrim, a scholar, or an ambitious noble, the ruins of Rome presented a spectacle unmatched in the world. Fragments of amphitheaters, arches, temples, and palaces strewn across a vast terrain, each structure bearing witness to the prodigious scale of imperial greatness. Yet these remnants did not inspire the Romans themselves with renewed civic virtue. Instead, the inhabitants of the 15th century lived among the ruins like indifferent tenants, barely aware of the magnificence that had preceded them. Their fields grazed cattle where senators once debated. Their huts nestled against walls that had withstood the triumphs and tragedies of 1,000 years. And their daily life expressed more resignation than reverence. Gibbon observes that the ruins of Rome were not solely the work of time, but equally the result of deliberate human spoliation. The Middle Ages had been unkind to the legacy of antiquity. Marble statues were burned for lime, bronze ornaments torn down for coinage, and entire monuments reduced to quarries for the construction of churches and fortresses. The Colosseum, that iconic reservoir of Roman might, had become a mountain of stone used by popes and nobles alike for their private projects. The Roman Forum, a once orderly center of republican and imperial life, was now a wilderness of broken shafts and buried capitals, its ancient pavements obscured beneath layers of earth. Even the Pantheon, miraculously preserved in form, had been stripped of its gilded tiles and pagan dignity, converted into a Christian shrine. The transformation was not merely physical, but symbolic. The pagan gods had yielded to the saints, and the imperial spirit had faded into ecclesiastical ritual. Despite this devastation, the ruins exercised a profound influence on the emerging Renaissance mind. Scholars, awakened to the intellectual treasures of antiquity, began to wander among the monuments with curiosity and reverence. They measured, cataloged, and sketched the remnants. They deciphered inscriptions, collected fragments, and sought in every stone the echoes of republican virtue and imperial discipline. Petrarch, Poggio Braccioli, and other humanists lamented the ruin of Rome, yet found in its decay a kind of moral instruction, a silent sermon on the mutability of empire and the vanity of human greatness. Their rediscovery of classical texts and their interpretation of the ruins helped breathe new life into the arts and letters, so that Rome, even in its desolation, became the cradle of a cultural rebirth. Yet the Romans themselves, those who lived among the relics, remained largely untouched by this intellectual revival. They saw the ruins primarily as useful resources or as dangerous remnants inhabited by spirits of the past. Superstition clung to the broken monuments, and daily survival took precedence over historical contemplation. The city's population had shrunk dramatically. Wars, plagues, and economic decline had reduced Rome to a provincial town whose people huddled in the area around the Tiber, leaving vast swaths of the ancient city abandoned. Sheep grazed on the Palatine Hill, vines climbed the arches of the aqueducts, and solitary towers erected by feuding noble families punctuated the skyline like grim substitutes for the imperial architecture they overshadowed. Gibbon notes the contrast between the magnificence of Rome's past and the poverty of its present with a tone that blends sorrow and irony. For the city that once commanded the world now depended on the uncertain patronage of the popes, whose temporal power had fluctuated wildly. The papacy, revived from the Avignon exile and restored after the Great Schism, sought to rebuild Rome, but lacked the resources to restore more than isolated monuments. Churches and palaces were erected atop ancient foundations, roads and aqueducts were patched, but the city as a whole remained a ruinous giant, overwhelming in scale, fragile in substance, and reflective of a civilization whose vitality had long since ebbed away. Nevertheless, the ruins of Rome served a dual purpose. They were at once the corpse of the old world and the seedbed of the new. Renaissance artists drew inspiration from the shattered fragments of imperial architecture, adopting classical proportions and reviving ancient ornamentation. Humanists rooted their moral and political philosophies in the examples idealized yet compelling of Romans' heroic heroes. And the papacy, adopting the imagery of ancient authority, gradually fashioned itself into a power whose ceremonial grandeur echoed, however faintly, the imperial majesty of old. Rome, though broken, remained a symbol, and in the 15th century, that symbol began to animate a new vision of civilization. The chapter closes with a meditation on the fate of empires. Rome had risen from a humble village to a dominion that encompassed the known world. It had endured through monarchy, republic, and empire, and it had outlasted its conquerors. Yet the ruins now standing testified that even the mightiest institutions must yield to time, misfortune, and the folly of men. Still, Gibbon insists, the grandeur of Rome was not truly extinguished. Its memory, inscribed upon stone and preserved in human imagination, remained a potent force. The ruins spoke of achievement rather than obliteration, of perseverance rather than final loss. They stood as reminders that while power collapses and cities fall, the legacy of a great civilization, its ideas, its art, its laws, its vision of human potential, can survive the wreckage of centuries.